Hello, everyone. Hey, welcome back to the Veteran Lang YouTube channel, where we talk about VA disability. As always, I'm your friendly VA accredited attorney, Matthew Lang, here to talk about that VA disability. But before I do, I want to give a thank you to everyone and their support. Appreciate you more than you can ever imagine. The opportunity to help veterans has been a goal and a dream for a number of years now, and to be able to provide this education and knowledge in this platform has really been a joy. With that, I also want to say thank you to the constructive feedback comments and those who have provided those. Many times it's hard for us to see ourselves in how things are coming across, and I've lost a little quality, I think, in a few videos. Now, I'm not working with the most expensive equipment. Heck, no expensive equipment at all. And I do know that over the years and probably my whole life, I've not always been the clearest speaker. So I do have some challenges, but I do appreciate the feedback to allow me to try to correct those challenges over time. Make the videos with the best quality that I possibly can. So again, I thank everyone. And I especially thank those who have provided that constructive feedback. And I also thank everyone for their patience as I continue to improve in the quality of these videos. Now, let's get down to it. Today's video comes from a comment with a hypothetical involving Gulf War. I'm going to use that hypothetical in explaining this. But my ultimate purpose is to demonstrate how law can have multiple provisions for which one condition can be service-connected under. Now we know we got our direct theories, we've got our secondary theories, we've got our presumptive theories. Those are really technically different laws, provisions of laws that allow multiple different ways of service connection. But for Gulf War vets, there happens to be a couple other provisions that leave open a door of possibilities. Now, these provisions also lead to some confusion when it comes to effective dates. So I want to explain that as well as we go forward. So by now you might be asking me, what are you talking about there? Attorney Lang, Veteran Lang, what are you talking about? Well, let's start with the idea that we have a big umbrella of law. I'm not going to go all the way to the Constitution at this point. But let's think about the idea of the United States Code. So Title 38 of the United States Code holds our VA laws. When Congress passes a law, it ultimately amends the United States Code. So in our case, when the PACT Act came out in August of 2022, the PACT Act was amending the United States Code. Well, the PACT Act did a lot of other things for us, and I'm going to just do a small sliver of it as I talk about the Gulf War, just to highlight how a condition could fall underneath two provisions. What we didn't have before the PACT Act was a list of presumptive conditions, truly presumptive conditions for the Gulf War veterans. We didn't have the same locations that the PACT Act is providing now that veterans could have served in and have these conditions presumptive to. What we had before, and what we still actually have on the books, was a section known as undiagnosed illness and chronic multi-symptom illness. The individuals coming back from the Gulf War originally perhaps left the medical community a little confused. It took time and research to understand some of the conditions these individuals were having when they came back. So the law originally put it underneath this idea that it was undiagnosed or was this multi-symptom illness. Now, we're not going to get into the full definitions of all that today, but just know that that provision was there before the PACT Act, and it's still there today. Why is it still there today? Because the PACT Act, in all of its amending of the code, didn't change the idea of the undiagnosed illnesses or the chronic multi-symptom illness. Sure, it may have changed a couple pieces of verbiage within there, but it didn't change the concept. So what does that mean, ultimately, for a claim? Well, let's take the idea that, say you, veteran, you served in the Gulf. You served in a qualifying area that matches both the undiagnosed side and the PACT Act side. Now, when you came back, eventually you ended up with, say, a condition of GERD or IBS. Well, when we look at the undiagnosed multi-symptom provision of the law, we find that conditions like GERD and IBS could fall here. But this is not a presumptive portion of law. So there's still nexus opinions that need to be made and evidence that needs to support the service connection underneath that law. When we come back over here to the PACT Act, we find that we did receive a series of presumptive conditions that Congress wrote into the law. Among that whole list of conditions, however, conditions like GERD and IBS are not listed. So we do not have a presumptive condition. So then you may be asking, well then how does the PACT Act apply to this situation? Well, the PACT Act is very robust. And in its size, we find another section that Congress opened the door to allow us to potentially still get service connection for things like GERD or IBS in the Gulf War to the PACT Act. And that's the idea of a toxic exposure. Now, perhaps our lawmakers and maybe the medical world doesn't feel that there's a clear enough evidence yet to say that GERD or IBS could be presumed due to Gulf War. But they're not quite saying it can't be. So the toxic exposure piece is written in requiring additional medical evidence, medical opinions, nexus opinions. Because you're not in a presumptive area, and you could still be underneath toxic exposure of the PACT Act, and because you could still be underneath undiagnosed illness or chronic multi-symptom illness, of a provision of law that was there before the PACT Act that did not get changed by the PACT Act, the VA now has to consider both provisions. When you, as a Gulf War veteran, in this case, file a claim for, in our example, IBS or GERD. You could get the service connection underneath the PACT Act as a toxic exposure, depending on the facts of your case, depending on how the evidence reads. But maybe the evidence says no to the PACT Act, but yes to the undiagnosed provision over here. What happens then? Well, you get your service connection, but we have another thing to talk about. When VA makes a decision, they're not just doing service connection, they're doing effective dates as well. When is that service connection effective? When is the grant of your IBS or GERD, in our case here, effective? Well, in a previous video, and you probably may know from other resources out there, the general rule of an effective date would be, well, typically the date of claim. And yeah, there's some other provisions in there, but for simplicity, let's think of date of claim. So the idea is if you filed for the first time, veterans, a Gulf War claim for IBS or GERD, because the PACT Act came out, so say you filed it in October of 2022, you may be thinking your effective date would hit one of these little provisions outside of the general rule. Oh yes, the provision of liberalizing law, as we call it. Well, the law changed, providing us presumptions, providing us toxic exposures. So the idea is underneath that provision, your effective date, if you're service connected underneath the new law, the PACT Act in this case, could make your effective date not the date of claim, but could take you back to the date of the law change, which would have been August of 2022. So instead, in our example of your date of claim being in October of 2022 as your date of claim, you could have an effective date back to August 2022 because the law changed date. Now, but remember, in our example here, we're under the idea that you didn't meet the toxic exposure piece. It's not presumptive underneath the list on the PACT Act. VA went back over here, re-looked at the laws and gathered the evidence and medical opinions and so forth, said, no, it fits more over here in the undiagnosed illness and the chronic multi-symptom illness section. Because of that, in that section not being really affected by the change of the PACT Act, we don't have a change of law that gets applied to your situation. So we can't apply the liberalizing law piece to your service connection underneath, well, what the undiagnosed illness and again the chronic multi-symptom illness provision of Gulf War. Then we ultimately fall back into the general rule of date of claim. So this is just really an example of how the law can have multiple working parts and how one provision can affect another provision of law. So the PACT Act could affect the effective date provisions. But at the same time, the law that's already in place can have an impact on those provisions as well. And it's all about deciding what provision applies. So in short, in our example, so it makes a little more sense. If the VA says, we looked at PACT Act for your IBS or GERD claim, we looked at, in this case, the undiagnosed illness or chronic multi-symptom illness, and we found that the evidence supported more on the undiagnosed provision and not the PACT Act, your effective date will follow the basic rule and some other potential exceptions there, like continuous prosecution if you have appealed multiple times. But if the VA finds that the evidence supports the toxic exposure PACT Act piece of it all, well, I would argue then that the liberalizing law provisions of your effective date rules would apply, and that could give you an earlier effective date than you would normally receive. But in this case, if you filed your claim in October of 2022, you got service connection for GERD or IBS underneath undiagnosed multi-symptom, then your effective date would likely be October 2022, assuming there's no other claim related before that. And not August of 2022, because liberalizing law no longer plays effect. Now, does that mean that the VA is right? Yes and no. This is where I would say veterans consider a representative, consider a VSO, consider an accredited agent, or even another accredited attorney like myself. This could be a potential area where perhaps it got thrown underneath one provision, but it should have been underneath the other. We have had claims back here in the opposite of our example here, where even VA got so familiar with the PACT Act being so new and in front of their face all the time, which it only makes sense because it was really out there, that it would seem that this is the only Gulf War provision in the law. And they were denying everything for not meeting the presumptive list or the toxic exposure. But we had to go back and say, well, wait, you forgot about the rule that's still in place over here underneath undiagnosed illness and the chronic multi-symptom. So I think if VA is able to make that error, I think all of us can. But we have to remember there's more than one provision in the law which can get you service connection. And that's why I would recommend some sort of representation in this situation, veterans. Now, do you always need a rep? No. I've done that video and I've told you don't. But it could be recommended at this point to have somebody look at it and help sort that out. Now, I'm hoping that this made sense. The whole concept in the disability talk today was to show you and provide that education level that law isn't always clear. There are many times multiple provisions, different rules, other exceptions that can change the outcome to a decision, whether it be service connection, an evaluation, or an effective date. But our example here today, the provisions affected the effective date rules. All right, everyone. Again, I always thank you for your support. Thank you for bearing with me through another video. I look forward again to another video next week. This one has been recorded right before the 4th of July holiday for Independence Day. So I wish everyone an early happy Independence Day, and remember to be safe out there. Don't blow off your hand, even though it could be fun. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you again.